Hello and welcome everyone to this edition of the CTF Weekly Recap. I am your wonderful host, Bosquet, joined by some interesting fellows this week. Unfortunately, we had some availability issues with parts of our regular desk, so we're down to a three-man skeleton crew for the day. Your eyes do not deceive you, however. That is, in fact, Carson on his Ruska account here. Very fancy fellow, Carson, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yo, 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 what is up, cappers? This is me finally here in a physical form at the desk. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, somehow cannot get his old Carson account onto here, though, unfortunately. And Food Court as well is joining us today in place of a couple of our other hosts. Food Court.
Hello, guys. I'm Food Court. Happy to be here as well.
Yeah, interesting fellow. Olympus Pyromane these days, it would seem. But we're all very excited to join you because we had some interesting games that last week. I think it might have been, unfortunately, our most one-sided week so far. If you look at the results from last week, every single team that won 2-0, and every single team that won on the second map did so with a 4-0 scoreline. So as the games progressed, things did get a little more one-sided. With that said, there were definitely still some games that kept everyone entertained and involved. TB won 2-0 versus Annihilation in one of the games we were expecting to be a little more competitive this week. Unfortunately, didn't quite work out that way. Olympus versus Citrix, though, that definitely provided in the entertainment value department. And of course, Roxaseas didn't have too bad of a performance despite the loss against Delta Force, who got a win that really helped them turn things around. That was their actually first win so far of this new CTF league. Then, of course, we're rounding things out with Fotia, which won 2-0 against Team Fallen. I think a bit of an expected result, despite the fact that Tom and the rest of his team were clearly so terrified of Fotia last week on the desk. Not sure why that was the case, as they did wrap things up in short order, although Team Fallen, in fairness, did have some decent performances from their team as well, which I would love to talk about when we get to that point, which is going to be right now, since we're starting off with Fotia against Team Fallen here for our recap. Carson, in terms of those standout players for Team Fallen, who really jumps to mind? You know, who had a performance that kept things a bit closer with Fotia than you might have expected Team Fallen to otherwise be able to do?
Yeah, I think one of the standout players that a lot of people may have seen was actually the Vexicle player for Team Fallen. His plays on Assassin, although they did end up losing both maps. Sorry, he did do a good job of delaying a lot of captures and just full on stopping them himself with really clutch recoveries on map one. It's a shame I didn't get to see him on the assassin class for map two, but his work on map one was definitely stellar in my opinion.
And then for Fotia, I do think we can say that was an expected result. Everyone predicted that Fotia was going to be able to take that match last week, but in terms of their standout players, who really shone against Team Fallen? This was their first win, after all.
Yeah, I think again we can point to Jake or Yep as one of their main cappers, and he obviously he put in a lot of work in that match as well with I believe 4 caps against Team Fallen out of the the 8 that they got. So he was responsible for half their caps. I also think that Dog Shanty or Jaden, his work, although it was a little bit, it may have been like underappreciated, I think, but he definitely was there in the right place at the right time for those ninja backup steals, and those actually paid off. Those ninja backup steals turned into a couple of caps for Team Fotia.
And then I just want to ask both of you guys. We'll start off with Carson, but Food Court, feel free to chime in as well here. Looking forward, how do you see these two teams doing down the road? Do you think Footya or Team Fallen will be able to parlay the experience they got from this match into any further wins?
I think specifically for Fotia, I think they do have a lot of potential to improve and move up from their original 8th seed slot. And I could potentially see them going to maybe a 6 or even 5, or I would say 5 to 7 range is final prediction for their seeding at the end of the group stage because of the way that their other members of the roster, like Moraband and Zia, I think, is some of those defense players are getting a lot more experienced as the weeks progress, and I think that they have a lot of potential to improve their game sense and help boost their performance later on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Carson had to say there. One thing that was notable to me last week was in the post-match interview, Tom said that despite the fact that they won, he wants to see their offense improve a little bit more. He thinks they didn't play well. And I think most would agree that Tom is a very solid leader. And if he recognizes that something needs to be changed, I think he'll do everything he can to help the team be where they need to be. So I'm curious to see in these coming weeks what he's going to do, especially on the offensive end, to maybe improve Fosha's chances in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, and it'll be a very big test for them next week, obviously. That match still to come in our preview, but it'll be interesting to see what Tom is able to cook up for their future performance. Now, we're going to move on here to a match that wasn't actually streamed live this weekend. First time that's happened in season 1, which honestly speaks a lot to how far CMS has come. That's the first time we've had to record a match instead of live streaming so far. And unfortunately, it was one of the more competitive matches this weekend in the sense that both teams actually got captures. That, of course, being Delta Force versus the Roxorseas. Now, that match had a very competitive bazaar, but subsequently, Delta Force really were able to turn on the Jets and win Rundown a bit more convincingly. So, Food Court, what do you think changed between the two maps? Why did Delta Force really step up as much as they did on Bazaar?
Honestly, between the two maps, I didn't see anything in their offense or their defense that changed much. I'd actually be willing to say that the reason between the two performances would be the nature of the map itself. Bazaar is known for being a very defensive map, whereas Rundown is also kind of like, it's kind of in the middle between like a defensive and an offensive map. So I think the nature of the map kind of helped Rox a little bit on delaying a few captures, making it more competitive than it should have been. But I think Rundown showed like what the result truly should have been, and that's that DF was just stronger in this match in particular.
Yeah, no, I think it's been pretty well communicated by our desk so far in the recap here that a lot of us consider Delta Force to be on the weaker end of the top teams, whereas Roxorseas is considered to be on the stronger end of the weak teams. And so far, I think in the last match, Delta Force did show us that there was a real gap between themselves and the Roxorseas. But with that in mind, do you consider that to be a good or a bad performance for Delta Force? It's obviously good for them to get a win and get some momentum from that, but do you think their performance lived up to what it could have been?
I definitely would say so. I would say actually every single match this season or tournament, whatever you want to call it, they have performed actually very well. Against CX, of course, they went to map 3, ended up losing that one. And against Olympus, they really should have won that game. I definitely think they've been performing consistently throughout the tournament. And I would say that they were able to actually put it together against Rox, maybe get some confidence back and see what they can do against the upcoming matches in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, and their match next week should definitely be an interesting one as well. Before we move on, I was curious if you felt there were any standout players on either team from that last game. Who do you think really shone for Delta Force? Who shone for the Roxorseas?
Well, while the player of the game was given to the Spartan 33 on Delta Force's end, I wanted to note that Gam did a whole lot of work to separate the Roxorseas offense, particularly sticking on 93. Who I would say would be Rox's main primary capper, biggest threat for them. So Gam doing that much work to 93 definitely helped them out. Additionally, commenting on the play styles between the two teams, I looked at Rox's offense in comparison to DF's, and what DF did consistently was having a Necro, Andra pocketing Lou the Medic, both maps. And if you saw how that worked out, the 5 people were able to make it to the flag room many times. And if you compare that to Rox's offense, like Mackie was kind of left on his own for the majority of the match. They had to commit Zuna to him about halfway through Bazaar, but if you looked at the two play styles between the two offenses, I just think the medic support definitely helped Delta Force out immensely, converting some steals into caps.
Yeah. One last one before we wrap up with this game. Rockstar Seeds are definitely going to have a bit of a tough schedule going forward. Obviously, this particular week, week 4 of the tournament, is going to be their bye week. But when they come back, they're going to be matched up against Annihilation, and their remaining games in the later rounds include matchups against Olympus, Citrix, and the Baguettes. So the tougher end of their schedule is definitely still coming up. With what you might consider a disappointing result for them against Delta Force, how do you think they can turn things around, improve in the coming weeks, and maybe show up stronger to some of those other tough matches?
I think it just has to be coordination on offense, honestly. If you look at the two styles the teams played this past week, it just seemed like Delta Force had people who were designated to support and people who were designated to be the main cappers. Whereas Roxas, you kind of saw everyone trying to steal, everyone trying to convert a capture. So I think they need to more define their offense, kind of going with the mindset that they should maybe have Fella steal, maybe have 93 steal, but they can't have everyone trying to steal the flag, everyone trying to capture, or else they probably won't be able to convert much, especially against those tough teams, those tough defenses. I think the offense needs to stand out and coordinate particularly well.
All right, now moving along here, we've got Olympus versus Citrix up next, and that was one of the more interesting matches, especially on the first map, which did end up with a relatively close 2-1 scoreline. Now, if I'm being entirely honest, watching it, it didn't always feel that way. It did feel like Olympus sort of held an advantage throughout the entire match. But with that in mind, Carson here briefly, what do you think changed between maps 1 and 2 for those teams?
I think that I remember map 1 for most of the map was actually a lot of stalemates, namely one where Sir Leo was holding for Olympus and Color was holding for Citrix. And that entire time, I think that the momentum was going in Olympus's favor throughout the entirety of that stalemate. And the momentum that they carried from map 1 to 2 was really proven by Olympus when they started running their more maybe not as experienced elf players, but they are still definitely mechanically very talented in the form of Participated and Aussie on elf second map. And in previous weeks, I believe it was week 1 when Rundown was last played, we saw the dominance of elf on Rundown, and I think that the elf players on Olympus simply outshined and were able to convert those steals into captures a lot more frequently than Citrix on map 2 there.
And of course, I do want to ask the same question here to Food Court briefly, since he was very much involved in both of those matches, playing for Olympus as, again, their Pyro.
Definitely. What I think changed between first and second map, or what helped us kind of bring it home in the second map, was definitely, as Carson said, the momentum of that stalemate. During that whole stalemate, we were coordinating. Like, I think we should have gotten it a lot sooner, considering Collar was very low on stake. Like, for 10 minutes, we were consistently getting him low. But I think finally breaking through and getting that stalemate victory gave us a lot of confidence moving into Bazaar. Or not Bazaar, moving into Rundown.
Yeah, now going into that match, I did see Olympus take notice of my prediction about how that game was going to go. Specifically with regards to Evan perhaps having his ankles broken by Bub and Yubao, and perhaps something along the lines of Olympus tilting after the fact and throwing the game away against Citrix. That prediction obviously didn't come true, but one of the reasons why it didn't was because Evan simply wasn't playing. Instead, we saw a very different look from Olympus on defense. Food Court, could you perhaps walk us through the changes that Olympus defense made and why perhaps he made them?
Yeah, well, the mindset there was obviously if you look at our first two performances against, first two against Delta Force and the Baguettes, obviously we aren't performing to the standards we're used to. So we sat down and new changes had to be made. So we decided to go with kind of a new outlook in this match. We decided to run Karo on bulk instead of Pyro. We ran Trenny instead of Evan, and we kind of just mixed things up a little bit. Tried to keep we made a point of emphasis to communicate more efficiently and more effectively and to not tilt, not complain, stuff like that. I definitely think progress was made in this game, but we still got a long way to go. So we'll see how it shapes up.
Yeah, definitely. Now, with that all in mind, Citrix were going into that game perhaps looking for a momentum win after a close game against TB. And despite some split predictions in the community, I think it's fair to say Olympus won that pretty convincingly. Citrix maybe didn't get what they were looking for. So they did have some differences in their roster that match, specifically some of their, I might even say, carry players in Avedis, Tri, or Sam, and Yubao didn't make it into that match. Do you think that was an availability thing, or was that more of an issue with Citrix deciding that those players didn't perhaps fit the look they were going for?
In terms of Avedis, I definitely think that's an availability thing. Him and Wolfie are known to be a fantastic ninja duo, especially on CX. They do a lot of work together, perform well, have good synergy. In terms of Tri and Yubao, I'm not so sure on that, but I definitely think Olympus, we got lucky not having to face it off against those three, certainly. Got a little bit of help there. But for CX in general, I think they need to work on their synergy. I think they need to kind of pick out players who they think need to play together, because if we see we have Pudgy and Crystal switching off on Medic, we see Yubao and Flaze and Fatal rotating a little bit. I think they need to kind of develop that synergy with their offense, decide who's going to play with who, how they want to play. Because if you keep rotating so often, it's impossible to build teamwork between the players.
All right, definitely some good suggestions there that Citrix might want to pay heed to. Before we move on, Carson, did you have any suggestions yourself for how Citrix might want to bounce back in the coming weeks? What they could perhaps do to improve their play overall?
I didn't have anything crazy specific. I do think that what Food Court said holds true for Citrix very well. I think that getting some of those players in specific roles that they are comfortable with and sticking with those roles so that they can probably improve and will learn to play with their teammates better. I know map 1 against Olympus, I believe they ran Scapesar, newly promoted senior moderator on Brawl.com, but he was the medic offense for them as opposed to the normal Pudgy that we see. That's the usual part of their squad on offense. But they also had, I believe K-Rex was, he definitely earned a capture for them as well. And those usually aren't the players we see. I think those are good players to have, but getting situated in a role and learning to be comfortable with one another is the biggest thing that I would say.
All right, now before we move on from our recaps here, we do have one more match to touch on. That, of course, being the tragic annihilation loss against the Bugettes in a game that, again, did receive some hype going into it, but TB came out, and I think it's fair to say they won that very convincingly. So, Carson, I know you're relatively familiar with that game. Who do you think were the players that really set TB apart in that match? Why did they win so convincingly?
I have to say, I think on map 1 specifically on offense for TB, the Pavlik soldier was incredibly strong for the Baguettes. I noticed several times on stream that his routing was extremely intelligent and really good at dodging the defenders on Annihilation. And I think that the support that he got from Calligraphus too was also really helpful for the TB's captures. And as I'm doing a little bit of Pavlik cosplay here, I really admire what he did on Bazaar and a little bit of on Rundown as well. But mostly Bazaar. Map 1 was Pavlik's playground basically for capturing flags there.
Yeah, and they did also have some other interesting players on offense. Specifically, Koka and Dutch were in for that match, while Exedra and Ronger, who'd been playing a lot of their previous matches, weren't playing offense for them. Do you think those are substitutions that were made to perhaps provide a bit of a new look for TB's offense, or is that again just a bit of an availability thing?
Um, I I can't I don't have a lot of the information to speak on availability for those two players that they had played in previous weeks, but with players like Exedra, who are normally such huge assets on an offense for a team like the Baguettes, um, I have to assume maybe it was a decision to allow players like Dutch and Coca to just get more play time against other teams. I know in the past when I had been on the Baguettes previously, they had focused a lot on just giving people play time and allowing the other members of the team to participate in some matches. I have to feel that although I'm not entirely informed on the matter, I have to think that that's the majority, or that that's the primary goal of running those players on offense.
Now, for Annihilation, of course, that was definitely a disappointing result, I think it's fair to say. But there were some odd circumstances about the match. Obviously, it had to be dropped to a 10v10. And of course, Annihilation was playing a roster as well that featured players outside of some of their comfort roles, notably also playing Austin or A Frog Dog on Mage. With that all in mind, how much stock do you think teams should put into Annihilation losing that match? Is it a sign perhaps of the team's overall weakness, or is it more an unfortunate result of Annihilation having to make some strange roster decisions due to availability?
I think it's a bit of a combination of both. I definitely availability was an issue for the team. We were missing players on our defensive roles, such as Danny on Ninja, and I don't believe we ran a bulk player on map one, and instead had to run a Frog Dog on Mage. And I think that while that is obviously an availability issue for some players, I think as an outsider, if I were another team, I would look at the Annihilation roster there and say, and I would be able to identify some potential depth issues that they have on certain defensive roles, such as Ninja and Bulk. And the we we do have like some solid players there to play those roles, but when those players aren't available, it can definitely prove as an issue for the team there.
Yeah, well, it'll definitely be a storyline to follow for the coming weeks, I think it's fair to say, as Annihilation is going to have to do a lot of work to bounce back from that TB match. They do have a tough match coming up this weekend that we'll touch upon a bit later, but that wraps up all of our recaps so far for this week. Moving on here, I did want to ask you guys some questions about how the metagame has been shaping up a bit for this first season of the CTF League. Starting off here, there is actually a patch that will become active for next week's matches. Chemist is getting an additional buff to its armor to make it a bit tankier. I believe this comes out to be about 12% increased survivability for the Chemist in terms of damage reduction. So, do you think that's going to be enough of a change, Food Court, to really propel Chemist to be a more important class for offense, or is it really going to be more of a quality of life thing, and Chemist will still only really see negligible play or minor play as a secondary capping threat?
I definitely think it's going to become more ingrained in offenses than it was before. If we look at the past tournament, obviously Chemist had Resistance 1, and that was obviously very strong. I'm not sure exactly how the values compare to the new Chemist, but given even if it's somewhat close to what it was with S1, I definitely think teams have Chemist players. Like, there's definitely players on multiple teams who can flex into that role. And if it's given some practice and maybe some like trials and PPMs, casual even, we'll see that Chemist will be more ingrained in the meta. I definitely think teams are going to experiment with that going forward.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that class over the next couple of weeks. There are definitely some teams playing next week who have a history of using Chemist on offense, so it'll be interesting to see if that crops up in the future. Speaking of teams, I did want to ask both of you guys if you feel there are any teams. Just give me one team that you feel might be on the rise right now. Teams that should be considered more threatening than they have been in the past. Who's on their way up? Food court.
I'd say it has to be CX. Like I know we're not necessarily talking about chemists, but I think CX has two fantastic chemists, Yubao and Flays, both made in the class, and play it very effectively. So we'll see if they're able to be major parts of the CX offense going forward. And even without chemist, I think if they're able to work out a few kinks within their team, I think they can actually maybe even snag the third spot this season going into playoffs.
Yeah, I agree with Food Court about Citrix, but I also wanted to give an honorable mention to Photia, and their potential to rise up in the rankings here in the next weeks of the stage, the group stage of the season. I think going back to the meta changes we discussed, I can name on just about every single strong team a good chemist player that might see playtime for their individual and respective offenses. And in the case of Photia, it's definitely got to be Tom D53. With his capabilities as a chemist and as a leader for offense, I think having him be able to get a little bit of a buff for his main role will definitely propel them to possibly some stronger offensive showings that I know he had mentioned they hadn't been performing as well. But with learning from their previous weeks and a couple like statistical buffs to the roles that their players are playing, I think that can help them on the rise for the next part of the group stage.
Yeah, with that in mind, Carson, I do want to follow up here. Their next three matches are going to be against TB, against Olympus, and against Citrix. I know you're saying that Photia is on its way up, but do you think that they could potentially upset any of those perhaps tougher teams in the next few weeks?
That for the next couple of them, I remain a little bit doubtful, if I'm being honest, um, about the possibility of a Photia upset. I think their round 6 matchup versus Citrix, I believe, is going to be their best bet at possibly pulling off an upset. I think they could definitely learn a lot from these next 2 weeks, and um, they could potentially use that information as well as their improvement in teamwork on offense and just target priority and coordination on defense as well. I think if things go their way and they're able to pull something out of nowhere, maybe that could definitely be something that they could look forward to in round 6.
All right. And one last question here on the state of the meta before we move on. One thing, there are a couple compositions actually that we saw teams run a bit more over these last few weeks. Generally, in the past, a lot of teams had been using something of a meta 2 ninja comp, and I've actually seen a lot of teams move away from that for a couple different looks. For starters, this last week, we saw a few teams, both winners and losers, run a double bulk setup on maps that sometimes don't see double bulk. Obviously, Olympus ran that setup without an archer, even against Citrix. And then we also did see it from both the Rockstar Seas and Team Fallen, where all of those teams ran 2 soldiers on defense. Food Court, do you think that look is something that we'll see a bit more in the coming weeks, at least on maps that perhaps favor that double bulk setup? Or is it more of a passing fad this last week, one that maybe was being run just because of situational decisions from those teams? Yeah, I think we might have lost Food Court here, unfortunately. As Food Court tries to figure things out here, Carson, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. Hopefully Food Court can return swiftly, but I think the double bulk that we have seen could definitely make a comeback on maps that we have yet to be seen in the rotation for the weeks that we have seen. But in the future, we're going to see maps like Airlock 1 and Adrenaline, possibly Adrenaline, but definitely some bulk-heavy maps such as Waitomo and Airlock 1 in the future. I think it's going to depend a lot on the maps, but with what we saw from Olympus, I think the strong showing from Trenny and Carowinds, I definitely am optimistic about seeing those two play bulk together and possibly adding Saiyan in as a potential second bulk player there. And other teams as well could definitely play that double bulk fairly successfully.
And Food Court, since I think I heard you grunting there a second ago, would you like to add
Yeah.
any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, apologies for the mic issues. Yeah, going off of that, even on Bazaar in particular, on original and the new rework here, Olympus always ran double bulk. We'd run a soldier to kind of take care of the top spawn, and then we'd run a heavy to kind of control the middle of the map flag room area. I definitely think on Bazaar 1 that still holds true. It was definitely strong having Caro able to patrol that top spawn area, focus on the offensive soldiers, and then Trenny can clean up his heavy in the middle of the map. So I definitely think double bulk is a very strong kind of composition that you can run on defense on Bazaar. In terms of other maps, however, I'm not so sure given that how big Elf is right now. I think you need that ninja mobility to be able to counter that Elf. So we'll see, but I definitely think double ninja will still be something that teams will kind of default to, especially against Elf.
Well, speaking of another alternative to the double ninja, one thing that we saw a few teams running in previous weeks, and I think I want to attribute this to TB starting off in terms of popularity, but I could be wrong on that. So let me know if I am in the comments. For this composition, you'll see one bulk player on the roaming, in addition to one ninja, with the teams running both assassin and scout as well. For TB, obviously, this takes the form of Recovs and Chickdee playing in those roles. If you were to have Olympus do the same thing, you might see Sam on Assassin and Rhodes on Scout, or vice versa, quite frankly, as they both play those roles to at least a decent level, perhaps even seeing Dave on the Scout there as well. For those defenses, again, I do want to ask what you think of their viability in the current meta, Carson, and if you think we'll see them played more relative to the double ninja compositions that have become such a hallmark of CTF defenses.
Yeah, it's very interesting seeing teams being able to run those not as common compositions on defense. I have to say though, I am of the belief that it is due to such strong depths on those top tier teams. The fact that the Baguettes is able to have arguably the best ninja in the game, Recovs, switch over to Scout and still have two reliable ninjas in the form of Tireless and Seago, and maybe even Seago switching over to Bulk or something. The fact that they can make that move and still be one of the best defenses or defense compositions in the game, I think just speaks to the depth of their team and mostly to their defense, because teams like the Baguettes and Olympus um, have such strong defenses and a lot stronger than others, I feel. So when teams have that depth, I think it's definitely a good choice to run those scouts and um, in trying to fit those scouts into their defenses. But in other cases, I think that running the standard double ninja might just be a little bit more successful, or it might prove a little bit more successful for teams that just need to get that damage in and need that mobility.
All right, Food Court, any thoughts on that composition?
I'd actually basically 100% agree with what Carson had to say in terms of the depth of the top teams, being able to kind of be flexible with that. In terms of like on a base level of that composition versus the double ninja, I don't think we really know yet, to be honest. I think this is the first kind of tournament season where we've seen the running of Scout like kind of become big, I would say. So I think we need to kind of get a little bit more of a sample size before I can truly form an opinion on if this meta is going to be kind of commonplace after this season.
All right, well, it'll be an interesting question to see develop going forward. Now, I think we're going to wrap things up on the meta here. We've got some interesting matches in this next week to talk about, but before we get to the matches themselves, let's have a little talk here about the map pool for this coming week, since that's actually going to be pretty impactful for a lot of teams. Uh, Obviously, first map this week is going to be Pagodas 3. That'll be followed up by AIRLOCK, and subsequently, we'll see the debut of Adrenaline 1 as the third map. But for Pagodas in particular, we talked a bit earlier about the Chemist buff coming up for its survivability. So, do you feel that at least on that first map, we'll have an opportunity to see some teams run Chemist and see how viable it actually is?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Carson.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm really excited about Chemist in these upcoming maps. I know that in the Delta Force Annihilation match, I could probably expect to see DTJ run a really strong chem if he's there for the Delta Force's offense, and other players in both rosters as well. But for Pagodas 3, I know that historically, um, we've seen a lot of players shine, especially in the team tourney from earlier this year and the draft tournament as well. Um, Chemists have had their fair share of captures on a lot of different teams for that map, and I'm really excited for Chemist on Pagodas 3, and perhaps even AIRLOCK as well. I know that with the recent Chemist nerfs, it has kind of fallen off on AIRLOCK due to heavies being so strong against it on defense, but I think that the number of Chemist caps we see might be on the rise here in the next weeks.
Now, speaking of which, AIRLOCK is going to be the second map in the rotation, and that's a map that's been more traditionally known for the way that Bulk it's favored on it in the past. Now, we've had, I think it's fair to say, a pretty mobility-centric meta develop so far in this first season of the CTF League. Do you think Bulk is strong enough on AIRLOCK that we'll at least see some teams try to run bulkier offenses there, or will we still see more of a favor given towards soldiers, elves, and things of that sort?
That's a really good question, and thinking about it, teams traditionally would run that kind of double bulk look on defense on AIRLOCK. And I'm not sure if the best way to counter that would be to go bulk yourself. I think the best way to counter that double heavy would actually be to favor some mobility. So you have some mobility with Chemist giving the jump pots and Elf given obviously wind element, stuff like that. So I think, especially on AIRLOCK, we'll maybe see some counters to that bulk being in the form of more mobility rather than trying to sponge damage and fight your way through and to convert captures.
All right, yeah. And before we move on here, I did want to get both of your opinions on the last map we're going to be seeing, Adrenaline 1, which hasn't been played so far. In fact, it's not really been playable for all that long. It's a bit of an interesting map in that it's a rework of Adrenaline, which was in the previous team's tournament, but has some pretty notable changes, especially when it comes to the size of the map, the area behind the flag room, where some of the sponges are, and so on and so forth. So, do you think that map is going to be as mobility favored as it has been in the past, or will we perhaps see some new playstyles develop, Carson?
I think that the strength of Elf, which was so prominent on the original Adrenaline map, will hold and just have the ability to prosper again on the new Adrenaline map. I think that the size of the map is definitely going to be a little bit more chaotic than previously, and especially with the underground being removed, I think stalemates will hopefully not last as long and be as um, irksome, I guess, for a lot of teams as the original Adrenaline, with the fact that heavies would hold in the underground on the original Adrenaline for so long during stalemates there. I'm really excited for this map to be played this week because of the faster pace that it has compared to other maps that we've seen so far.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I think that's going to wrap things up here for the map pool for us. Moving on here, we just have one major segment left, and that's talking about everyone's predictions for the upcoming matches. First things first, though, let's get a look at those. We've teased them before. Definitely a few matches that we expect to be a little bit one-sided here in this tournament. TB against Fotia, obviously being one of those. Team Fallen against Olympus being another. Citrix versus the Crusaders, at least in terms of the seeding, is a little closer. But I think the way a lot of us were looking at this, and I think for the audience as well, the big match of this week is going to be Delta Force against Annihilation. Two teams that have had some encouraging results early on, but also their fair share of struggles. So before we move on to everyone's predictions for this week, I do want to take a moment here and look back at how our hosts have done in the past. Unfortunately, Miski and Renee won't be here to defend themselves and their past predictions, but I don't think either of them have struggled quite as much as Carson. Obviously, with his, I don't want to call it DF homerism because it's not really homerism, but certainly his staunch defense of DF in some of these previous games not holding up quite as well. One thing I do want to point out about the desk predictions as well, we've included Tom's predictions from last week within the scope of Carson's predictions there. So the predictions listed as his last week are in fact Tom's predictions, where he got the Olympus versus Citrix game wrong. But I think it's fair to include them because that sort of pick was at least spiritually in line with what Carson might have tried to call that week. So, Carson, are we going to see things swing a little bit more in your favor in the future here, or are the predictions going to keep being a little rough, do you think?
I'm really hopeful. I know my predictions recently have been very, very close to being correct, and then at the end of those matches, I see it turn the other way. So I may try to play it a little bit more safe in the future here, but I'm definitely still interested in the potential for upsets in a lot of these matches.
Yeah, and Food Court, how about you? Do you have anything to say at the very least to the people who predicted Citrix last week, knowing that at least one of those people is here on the desk and speaking to you right now?
Carson, it's a shame that you didn't have any faith in us this week. But I'd just like to say, I think we're back on track. I think we're going to prove a lot of people wrong, and it's unfortunate that you couldn't see our potential.
Oh, well, technically, Carson wasn't here last week. I was referring to myself predicting against you.
Oh, well, same goes to you then.
Well, there you have it. Anyways, with that all wrapped up, let's take a look at our predictions for this week. Obviously, only 3 of us on the desk, so graphics going to be a little less complicated this time around, and unfortunately, also just a little less spicy. We've all predicted the same results for each match. We all have TB taking the win against Fotia. We all have Olympus taking the win against Team Fallen, and we all have Citrix taking the win against the Crusaders. Notably as well, nobody predicted Delta Force over Annihilation. Food Court and Carson, do you perhaps want to give us some reasoning behind that?
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, well, I'd like to say that this is probably obviously the closest match that we're probably going to see this week. And I think on a base level, I think Annie is a better team. But I think a lot of it may come down to what we saw last week with Annie is if they can get their players online. Like we talked earlier how Danny wasn't there. They were missing a few other pieces. Had to kind of drop to a 10v10, stuff like that. So I think I'm going to go with Annie just based off of what I know. But I think roster shakeups and stuff like that could definitely swing this match one way or another and could provide opportunities for Delta Force.
Yeah, and Carson, with that in mind, do you agree with that, or do you think Annihilation has victory more or less assured before the match even starts?
Well, first of all, I apologize, DF, for not picking y'all for the third time in my time here at the desk, but I do definitely see this going to a map 3. With Annihilation's comfort on Pagodas 3, I predict that they could definitely take that map as a win for them. Although that's not to say that Delta Force doesn't have strong soldiers that could easily cap on that map as well. But I think that with AIRLOCK almost being a coin flip in my eyes based on availability and the performance of those teams on the second map. So I could definitely see that going to Delta Force, although I as my prediction says, I feel like Annihilation could take map 2, but going to Adrenaline, I feel like Annihilation with Cardona getting a lot better on Elf and the mobility classes in the form of players like Miski and Chactation could definitely shine on map 3 for Annihilation.
Well, maybe it's a good thing for Delta Force that you're picking Annihilation finally over them. First 2 weeks, you picked Delta Force, didn't quite work out. Third week, you weren't there to pick Delta Force, and they did finally get a win. So
Right.
who knows? Maybe picking against them or just not being there at all is what they need to win.
That's very true. Yeah.
Anyways, as for the rest of the matches there, Food Court, do you feel that there are any matches outside of the Delta Force Annihilation one where we could perhaps see an upset?
Honestly, I just don't think so. Looking at how the matches have gone thus far, I think Citrix, the Baguettes, and Olympus both have looked a lot stronger than their opponents this week. So I'm gonna heavily favor those three to win their matches this weekend.
Carson, you hold the same opinion on that?
Yes, I as exciting as upsets are, I'm finding it really hard to see any that actually occur in these week 4 matchups. I think that there's a small possibility that maybe Citrix could get careless and the Crusaders could play the match of their lives, but other than that last match there on the list, I really don't see any upsets occurring personally.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll see those games at least be a little bit competitive for the sake of the viewers. But definitely, I think this week that one Delta Force Annihilation match is probably going to be the focal point. So, with that all wrapped up, I think we're just about at the point where we'll be closing up shop here. Any final thoughts from you, Carson, going into this next week of matches? Anything to really keep an eye out for?
I'm interested in my main interest for this week is going to be how Chemist plays out. I mentioned it earlier how a lot of teams have one, maybe even two strong Chemist players, but with some strong teams that have very flexible offenses, I'm really excited to see on these maps how Chemist plays out. That's the main thing I'm going to be looking for.
All right, and Food Court, how about you? What do you think the biggest storyline in this next week of matches is going to be?
I'm interested in Chemist, but I'm even more interested in Adrenaline. Actually, we haven't seen Adrenaline 1 played in a competitive scene very often. Like it's been some PPMs, but nothing to the degree we have now. And I'm curious to see how teams will go about it. If they'll play it similar to how old Adrenaline was, or if they'll kind of deviate, try some new stuff out. I'm just interested to see how that map works out and what compositions are favorable there.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap things up for us here. Thank you, Food Court and Carson, for joining us today, especially Food Court for being able to be here on short notice. It was great being able to hear from both of you. This has been a pretty fun experience again, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week when we'll take a look at some more matches and see how our predictions for this week held up. Thanks again, and we'll see you folks around.
I'm cutting dice,